Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Zeitun Apparitions, a series of events that would eventually capture the attention of millions and defy the explanations of both skeptics and believers alike. Imagine the air in Cairo on the 2nd of April, 1968. The heavy, dry heat of the day has finally begun to surrender to the cooling touch of evening. In the district of Zeitun, life moves with a rhythmic, unhurried pace. The streets are filled with the lingering scents of North African dust, roasting coffee, and the faint, sweet aroma of jasmine carried on a light breeze. The sun has been gone for an hour and a half, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple that stretches across the horizon, illuminated only by the flicker of street lamps and the glowing windows of the surrounding tenements. It is 8:30 in the evening, a time of transition between the labor of the day and the rest of the night. At the heart of this neighborhood lies Tumanbay Street, a busy thoroughfare that hums with the life of the city. On one side of the road sits the Public Transport Authority garage, a cavernous space where the city's buses are brought for repair and rest. Inside, the environment is a sharp contrast to the soft evening outside. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, old rubber, and the heavy, metallic tang of industrial grease that seems to coat every surface. The floor is stained with circles of oil that catch the yellow glow of the overhead lights, reflecting like dark, murky mirrors. Here, the sounds are mechanical and steady. The rhythmic clinking of wrenches against steel, the low hiss of pneumatic tools, and the deep, guttering murmurs of men who have spent their lives tending to the iron hearts of machines. Among them is a mechanic named Farouk Mohammed Atwa, a man of 31 years whose life is defined by the practical and the physical. Farouk is moving with a certain carefulness tonight. Beneath the layers of grime and the grit of the garage, he carries a private burden of pain. His finger is badly injured, darkened by a severe case of gangrene that has resisted treatment. The pain is a constant, throbbing presence, a sharp reminder of the fragility of the body. He knows that his time with this part of himself is short. An amputation has already been scheduled for the very next morning at the hospital. As he prepares to finish his shift, his mind is likely occupied with the uncertainty of the coming day and the weight of the surgery. He is a man of faith, a Muslim working in a city of many cultures, but his immediate world is one of cold metal and the hard reality of his ailment. He steps toward the gate of the garage, seeking a moment of fresh air to clear the fumes of the workshop from his lungs. Directly across the street stands the Coptic Orthodox Church of St. Mary. It is a beautiful, modest structure built in 1925, its white domes rising like pale bubbles against the dark velvet of the Egyptian sky. The church was constructed on a site steeped in ancient tradition, believed to be one of the places where the Holy Family found shelter during their flight into Egypt many centuries ago. On this Tuesday night, the church is quiet. Its silhouette is sharp and clear, the central dome topped with a cross that reaches toward the stars. There is no reason for anyone to be atop that dome. It is a steep, curved surface of stone and plaster, dangerous and inaccessible to anyone without specialized equipment. Yet, as Farouk glances upward, his eyes are drawn to a movement that disrupts the stillness of the architecture. He blinks, perhaps thinking his eyes are playing tricks on him in the low light, but the image remains. There, standing on the very peak of the central dome, is a figure. It is a woman, dressed in robes of shimmering white that seem to catch and amplify the meager light of the street lamps below. She is positioned near the cross, her form clear and unmistakable against the night. To Farouk and his fellow workers who have now joined him at the gate, the sight is not one of wonder, but of immediate, chilling alarm. In the shadows and the distance, they do not see a miracle, they see a tragedy in motion. They assume she is a soul in despair, a woman who has somehow climbed the heights of the sanctuary to cast herself into the void. The mechanics, men of action and shared humanity, feel a surge of panic. They begin to shout, their voices rising above the low hum of the city. "Be careful," they cry out. "Lady, do not jump." Their words are a desperate plea, an attempt to bridge the distance between the pavement and the high, lonely dome. Farouk points his bandaged, aching finger toward the white shape, his heart racing as he expects to see her fall at any second. But the figure does not jump. She does not scream or weep. Instead, she moves with a grace that is utterly alien to the human frame. She glides across the curved surface of the dome as if the laws of gravity have been suspended. The white of her garments begins to change, intensifying into a soft, pulsating luminescence that glows with an inner light. A few pedestrians on Tumanbay Street stop in their tracks, their heads tilting back as they catch sight of the lady in white. The shouts of the garage workers have drawn a small crowd now, and the air is no longer filled with the sound of tools, but with the hushed, ragged breathing of people witnessing the impossible. One woman in the street cries out a name, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and recognition, identifying the figure as the Virgin Mary. As the seconds stretch into minutes, the nature of the event shifts. The fear of a suicide vanishes, replaced by a heavy, vibrating silence. The figure on the dome begins to kneel, her shimmering robes folding around her like liquid light as she bows toward the cross. The witnesses watch, paralyzed by the sight. This is no ordinary person. No human could stand on that steep incline, let alone move with such ethereal fluidity. Suddenly, small, glowing white shapes, like birds or doves made of pure energy, appear in the air around her, circling the dome in a silent, perfect choreography. They do not flap their wings like the pigeons of the city. They soar with a steady, haunting brilliance. The light from the lady seems to reach down toward the street, casting long, pale shadows and reflecting in the wide, dark eyes of the men from the garage. Farouk stands there, his hand still raised, his mind struggling to process the transition from a mechanical evening to a supernatural encounter. The crowd begins to grow as word spreads through the neighborhood. People pour out of the nearby apartments, leaving their dinners cooling on the tables, drawn by the strange light that has transformed their local church. Traffic on Tumanbay Street grinds to a halt as drivers abandon their vehicles to stare at the roof of St. Mary's. The air feels charged, as if a great storm is about to break, yet the scene remains peaceful, bathed in that otherworldly white glow. Farouk Mohammed Atwa, the mechanic who was the first to cry out, feels a strange sensation in his hand, a warmth that radiates from the center of his bandaged finger, but he is too mesmerized by the sight above to investigate. For now, there is only the lady on the dome, the silent white birds, and the beginning of a mystery that will remain etched in the stones of Zeitun for years to come. The night has only just begun, and the world is about to change. The sun rose over Cairo on Wednesday, the 3rd of April, 1968, with a deceptive sense of normalcy. The morning air was thin and carried the scent of scorched dust and the faint, sweet trail of jasmine from the gardens of the suburbs. In the district of Zeitun, the traffic on Tumanbay Street began its usual rhythmic clatter, but the air inside the Public Transport Authority garage was thick with a different kind of energy. The mechanics, who usually spoke of engines and oil, were quiet, their eyes drifting frequently to the stone domes of the Church of the Virgin Mary across the way. Among them was Farouk Mohammed Atwa. He stood in the early light, looking down at his hand. For days, his finger had been a source of agonizing pain, darkened by a spreading infection that the doctors had sternly identified as gangrene. The amputation was scheduled for that very morning. He could still feel the phantom weight of the heavy bandages that had bound his hand just hours before, but as he slowly unwound the linen, the breath caught in his throat. The skin beneath was clear, healthy, and whole. There was no trace of the decay that had threatened his limb. It was the first physical ripple of the phenomenon, a silent testimony that began to travel through the neighborhood faster than any radio broadcast could manage. By the time the afternoon heat began to settle into the pavement, the story of the mechanic's healing had woven itself into the fabric of the community. In the small cafes where men sipped dark coffee, and in the crowded markets, the name of the lady on the dome was whispered with a mixture of reverence and confusion. This was not a story that belonged to only one faith. The men in the garage were Muslims, as were many of the early witnesses, yet the church they looked upon was Coptic Orthodox. The walls of the church, built in 1924 to resemble a miniature Hagia Sophia, seemed to glow even in the harsh light of the Egyptian sun. The architecture, with its central dome surrounded by 4 smaller ones, had been designed by an Italian architect named Lea Mingeli, following a vision given to the landowner 40 years prior. Now, as the second evening approached, the community began to gather not out of habit, but out of a sudden, magnetic pull. They came from the neighboring apartment blocks, leaving their front doors unlocked and their evening meals half-prepared, drawn toward the street where the mundane and the miraculous had collided the night before. The local police precinct was not immune to the rising tide of excitement. Reports had been filed shortly after the first sighting, documented by officers who were professionally trained to be skeptical of the supernatural. The initial official stance was one of practical dismissal. They hypothesized that the light witnessed by the mechanics was a mere trick of the eye, perhaps a reflection of the newly installed street lamps against the smooth, curved surface of the church's white masonry. To the authorities, the idea of a woman walking on a dome so steep that no human could find purchase was a matter for the fire brigade or a psychiatric evaluation, not a theological inquiry. On that second evening, several officers arrived at the scene with heavy flashlights and a sense of duty. They pushed through the growing crowd, their boots clicking against the stones, and made their way toward the entrance of the church. Their goal was simple: to find the source of the light, to identify the prankster, and to restore order to the busy thoroughfare of Tomanby Street. They climbed the narrow, winding stairs within the church towers, their beams cutting through the shadows of the rafters, searching for hidden projectors or mirrors that might explain the shimmering figure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the city into a soft, purple dusk, the crowd outside the church gates swelled from dozens to hundreds. It was a sea of diverse faces, reflecting the complex tapestry of Cairo itself. There were elderly women in dark shawls clutching prayer beads, young students from the university with their books forgotten in their laps, and laborers still wearing the dust of the day's work. The police, now positioned on the roof of the church, looked down at the mass of people and felt a growing sense of unease. They had scoured every inch of the domes. They had examined the crosses and the small arched windows, finding nothing but cold stone and the nests of pigeons. There were no wires, no hidden lamps, and no evidence of human intrusion. The darkness of the night seemed to deepen, making the white stone of the church appear almost luminous on its own. The officers switched off their flashlights, standing in the sudden gloom of the roof, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant murmur of the crowd below, a low, buzzing hum of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. In an attempt to prove their theory of light reflection, the police coordinated with the city's utility department to implement a temporary blackout. They ordered the power to be cut in a 15-mile radius around the district of Zeitun. One by one, the flickering street lamps of Tomanby Street went dark. The glowing windows of the surrounding apartments faded into black squares. The vibrant, chaotic lights of the city were extinguished, leaving the neighborhood in a rare, profound stillness. The moon had not yet risen, and the stars seemed far away. The officers stood on the church roof, waiting for the crowd to realize that without the artificial light of the city, there would be no apparition. They expected the people to disperse, to go back to their homes and their beds. But as the minutes ticked by in the total darkness, the silence grew heavier. The air was cool now, smelling of old incense and the damp earth of the Nile Delta. Every eye in the street was fixed upward, watching the silhouette of the central dome against the deep indigo of the sky. They were waiting for a light that did not require a switch, a glow that did not belong to the grid of the city, and in that darkness, the tension reached a breaking point. The official police reports from those early nights are fascinating in their clinical confusion. The officers noted that even with the electricity severed, the sky above the church did not remain entirely dark. They described intermittent flashes of light, like silent lightning, that seemed to emanate from the northeastern dome. These were not the sharp, distinct beams of a searchlight, but rather soft, pulsing rhythms of brilliance that appeared to originate from the air itself. The investigators, standing on the very stone they were meant to be protecting, found themselves looking at one another with widened eyes. They could not find a source for the fragrance of incense that suddenly drifted across the roof, a scent so thick and sweet that it seemed to belong to an ancient world. It was a smell that ignored the wind and the soot of the nearby garage. The reports began to shift from accusations of a hoax to descriptions of an unexplained atmospheric event. The local precinct realized that they were no longer dealing with a simple public disturbance. They were the first official witnesses to a mystery that was beginning to defy every law of physics they understood. And as the second night of the vigil continued, the skepticism of the law began to dissolve into the quiet awe of the people. As the reports from those early nights began to circulate, the quiet district of Zeitun was soon consumed by a tidal wave of humanity. What had started with a handful of bus mechanics and local residents quickly grew into a phenomenon that paralyzed the northern arteries of Cairo. By the third week of April, 1968, the modest streets surrounding the Church of St. Mary were no longer recognizable. Tumanbay Street, usually a bustling but manageable thoroughfare, became a solid floor of people. The small courtyard of the church, hemmed in by a simple fence, could not contain the influx. Eventually, that fence was pressed down by the sheer weight of thousands of bodies seeking a better view of the sky. From the perspective of the police watching from the periphery, it was as if the city itself were slowly drifting toward this single, luminous point in the darkness. The diversity of the crowd was perhaps more miraculous than the lights themselves. In a time of significant social and political tension, the streets of Zeitun became a sanctuary of shared purpose. You would have seen wealthy Coptic families from the center of the city standing shoulder to shoulder with laborers from the outlying industrial zones. Most striking was the presence of the Muslim majority, who arrived in their thousands, drawn by their own deep reverence for Mary, whom the Quran honors as the chosen of all women. The soundscape of these nights was a rich, vibrating tapestry. On one side of a crowded alley, you might hear the rhythmic, ancient chanting of Coptic hymns, their melodies unchanged for centuries. On the other, the melodic recitation of Quranic verses filled the air. Together, these sounds merged into a low, thunderous hum, a roar of collective hope that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement of Cairo. The infrastructure of Cairo was simply not equipped for a vigil of this magnitude. As the numbers swelled to an estimated 250,000 people on some nights, the city was forced to adapt. The authorities, initially skeptical and concerned with public order, found themselves roping off entire blocks to prevent a total collapse of movement. The local garage, where the first witnesses had been working, was eventually cleared away to provide more standing room. In a move that was both an investigation and a necessity, the government ordered the electricity to be severed across a 15-mile radius of the church. They wanted to prove that the lights were not the result of hidden projectors or stray reflections from the city's power grid. But when the lights went out, the street became even more surreal. The only glow came from the moon, the stars, and the expectant faces of 250,000 people. The wait was often long, stretching from sunset until the early hours of the morning, yet the energy of the crowd rarely flagged. People brought woven mats, blankets, and small samovars of tea turning the asphalt into a temporary home. Those who lived in the surrounding apartment buildings found their balconies and rooftops transformed into premium viewing platforms, often packed to the point of structural concern. The air was thick with a specific Cairo scent, a mixture of dry desert dust, roasting coffee, and the sweet, heavy perfume of jasmine blooming in the night air. Occasionally, a sudden wave of excitement would ripple through the masses. Someone would point to the sky as small, luminous objects, described by many as glowing white doves, began to circle the domes in silence. Others spoke of rains of diamonds, tiny flashes of light that seemed to fall from the heavens like silver snow. Each movement in the sky brought a collective intake of breath, a shared moment of suspension where every heart beat in unison. Even the highest levels of the Egyptian government could not ignore the pull of Zeitun. President Gamal Abdel Nasser himself, a man of secular politics and military precision, reportedly arrived one night to see the phenomenon for himself. He stood among his people, anonymous in the dark, watching the white domes for the sign they all craved. The roar of the city, usually a cacophony of car horns and street vendors, had been replaced by a different kind of sound, a hushed, reverent, expectant murmur that seemed to hold the weight of the entire nation's history. It was a time of recovery after a bitter war, and the people in the streets were looking for something that transcended the physical world. As the midnight hour approached, the cool breeze from the Nile Valley would sweep through the district, fluttering the robes of the priests and the headscarves of the grandmothers alike. Every person present, from the Marxist politician to the humble mechanic, felt the same electric tension. They were a sea of souls, anchored to the earth but eyes fixed firmly on the light above, waiting for the shadows to move and the mystery to reveal itself once more. While the political giants of Egypt watched from their black sedans, a different kind of authority was preparing to cast a formal eye upon the domes of Zeitun. Pope Cyril VI, the patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, was a man of deep asceticism and quiet prayer. He did not rush to the site when the first reports filtered into the patriarchate. Instead, he waited. He listened to the frantic whispers of the faithful and the skeptical questions of the press. But as the crowds swelled into the hundreds of thousands, the weight of the phenomenon demanded an official response. He knew that for the church to speak, it must do so with the precision of a scholar and the heart of a witness. Thus, he moved to appoint a sacred committee, a group of high-ranking clergymen and intellectuals tasked with stripping away the hysteria to find the core of the truth. This was not a gathering of the easily swayed, but a deliberate assembly of men trained in theology, science, and the rigorous observation of the divine. The committee was led by figures of immense gravity. There was Bishop Gregorios, the bishop of higher studies, Coptic culture, and scientific research. A man of intellect, he approached the mystery with a notebook and a sharp, discerning eye. Beside him stood Bishop Athanasius of Beni Suef, Bishop Samuel, and Bishop Nicolas. Together, they represented the intellectual and spiritual spine of the church. Their mission was simple in name, but daunting in practice. They were to travel to the suburb of Zeitun, find a vantage point amidst the chaos of the masses, and stay there for as long as it took to see the light with their own eyes. They were not looking for a fleeting trick of the mind. They were looking for something substantial, something that could be documented and defended against the scrutiny of the entire world. Imagine these men, dressed in their dark, flowing robes, ascending to the roof of the garage that stood directly across from the Church of St. Mary. The air in Cairo in late April of 1968 was thick and warm, carrying the scent of dust, jasmine, and the distant exhaust of the city. Below them, the street was a sea of humanity. The sound was a low, constant thrum, a mix of Coptic chants, Muslim prayers, and the restless shifting of thousands of feet on the pavement. The bishops found their places on the rooftop, settling into a long, patient vigil. They watched the white domes of the church, which looked like pale eggs resting against the velvet black of the night sky. For hours, there was nothing but the flickering of candles and the stars. They waited through the early hours of the morning, their eyes straining against the darkness, searching for a sign that would either confirm the faith of millions or expose a grand illusion. Then the atmosphere began to shift. The committee members noted a strange, rhythmic pulse in the air, a silence that seemed to descend even over the shouting crowds below. From the center of the church's roof, a glow began to manifest. It was not the harsh, yellow light of a lamp, nor the flickering orange of a fire. It was a cool, brilliant white, described by the bishops as a light that seemed to have its own substance. It emerged from the dark stone, growing in intensity until it formed a shimmering cloud. Within this radiance, the figures of the committee saw something that defied the laws of nature. They observed what appeared to be large, luminous pigeons. These were not birds of flesh and bone. They did not flap their wings in the way a common bird would. Instead, they glided through the air with a ghostly grace, their bodies emitting a soft, silver light. They moved in perfect circles, appearing and disappearing into the ether, leaving behind a trail of awe. As the bishops watched, the light coalesced further, taking on the distinct form of a woman. She was draped in a veil of light that shimmered like silk caught in a breeze. The committee documented her movements with meticulous care. She was not a static image, a slide projected onto a wall. She moved. She walked across the roof of the church, her feet seemingly hovering just above the masonry. She bowed toward the cross that topped the dome, and she turned toward the crowds, her hands outstretched in a gesture of profound blessing. The bishops noted the way the light from her form reflected off the surfaces of the church, proving that this was a three-dimensional presence in physical space. One of the most striking details they recorded was the scent. Even high on the rooftop, above the smell of the city, they were suddenly enveloped by a fragrance that was both floral and spicy, a heavy, celestial incense that seemed to descend from the very air around the apparition. For several nights, the committee returned to their post, witnessing these events repeat with varying intensity. They spoke to the people around them, gathering testimonies from doctors, engineers, and simple laborers. They looked for hidden projectors, for mirrors, or for any mechanism that could explain the spectacle, but they found only the empty, starlit sky. The bishops were particularly moved by the silence that the lady maintained. She did not speak in words, but her presence spoke of a deep, ancient peace. They watched as she moved through the orange trees on the church grounds, her silhouette glowing against the dark leaves. By the time they descended from the rooftop for the final time, the skepticism that some had carried had been replaced by a heavy, reverent certainty. They had come to investigate a mystery, and they found themselves humbled by a miracle. On May 4th, 1968, the committee delivered their findings to Pope Cyril VI. The report was a formal, somber document that detailed every sighting and every anomaly they had encountered. It stated, with the full weight of the Patriarchate, that these were indeed true apparitions of the Virgin Mary. The report described the light as being of a quality never before seen on earth, and the movements of the figure as being consistent and full of grace. This official declaration changed everything. It was no longer just a local wonder or a curiosity for the newspapers. It was now a confirmed event in the eyes of the Church. The news rippled out across the Mediterranean, through the streets of Rome and the halls of the Vatican. The Sacred Committee had finished their work, but their words had only just begun to ignite a flame of wonder that would draw the eyes of the entire world to a small, dusty street in Zeitun. The report from the Clerical Committee did not just sit on a shelf in the Patriarchate. It moved through the narrow, dust-swept streets of Cairo like a living thing, carrying with it a weight that the secular authorities could no longer ignore. By the late spring of 1968, the city was vibrating with an energy that felt almost physical. Thousands upon thousands of people were descending upon the suburb of Zeitun every single night. They came in battered buses, on the backs of carts, and on foot, walking for miles under the desert stars to reach the small Coptic church. The air in the neighborhood was thick with the scent of roasting corn from street vendors, the heavy humidity of the Nile, and the collective breath of 250,000 souls waiting for a glimpse of the divine. For the Egyptian government, this was no longer a simple matter of local folklore or religious enthusiasm. It was a massive public gathering that stretched the limits of the city's infrastructure and the patience of the police. At the center of this storm of faith was President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a man known for his secular nationalism and his pragmatic, often stern, approach to leadership. He was a figure of cold logic and hard politics, yet even he could not remain indifferent to the reports flowing into his office. The crowds were too large, the witnesses too diverse, and the phenomenon too persistent to be dismissed as a mere hallucination of the pious. President Nasser was a man who preferred to see the world through the lens of reality, and so he decided he must see for himself what was drawing the eyes of the nation toward the rooftops of Zeitun. In the deep of night, away from the prying eyes of the press and the flashbulbs of photographers, the president made his way toward the church. He did not arrive with a motorcade or the blare of sirens. Instead, he sought a vantage point that would allow him to observe without being observed. He was led to a building directly across from the Church of St. Mary, a structure that housed a garage for public transport. From a balcony or a window overlooking the church, the leader of Egypt sat in the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness of the room. Outside, the night air was cooling, but the heat of the day still radiated from the stone walls. He watched the domes of the church, their white surfaces reflecting the dim ambient light of the city. He waited for hours, a man of immense power sitting in total silence, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The atmosphere was one of tense anticipation, the kind of quiet that precedes a desert storm. They looked for wires, they looked for projectors, and they looked for any sign of an earthly trick that could explain the stories they had heard. Then the darkness began to shift. It started as a faint, pearlescent glow near the edge of the central dome, a light that seemed to come from within the stone rather than being cast upon it. As the president watched, the light coalesced, growing brighter and more defined until it took the shape of a woman draped in light. She did not flicker like a flame or fade like a passing cloud. Instead, she moved with a grace that was both steady and ethereal. Nasser, the soldier and the statesman, leaned forward into the cool air. He saw the figure walk across the roof, her robes shimmering with a phosphorescence that surpassed any electric light available in Cairo at the time. There was no sound from the figure, only the roar of the crowd below, which rose like a wave breaking against a cliff, as they, too, witnessed the manifestation. The president stayed for a long time, watching as the light changed form, sometimes appearing as a silhouette and other times as a radiant presence that seemed to bless the throngs of people. It is said that in those moments, the skepticism of the state began to dissolve. Nasser was seeing something that defied his military training and his political calculations. He was seeing something that could not be explained away by the Ministry of Information as a trick of the light or a mass delusion. The impact of this secret vigil was immediate and profound. Shortly after his visit, the tone of the Egyptian government shifted from one of cautious observation to official recognition. The state-run newspapers, which had previously been hesitant to lend weight to the supernatural, began to carry front-page stories of the events. The Ministry of Information released a statement that would become a cornerstone of the event's history. They declared that the sightings were real, that they had been investigated by technical experts, and that no human agency was responsible for the light. They confirmed that the electrical grid in the area had been shut off during the sightings to rule out projections, and still, the Lady of Zeitun appeared. This was an extraordinary moment in the history of the modern world. A secular, socialist-leaning government officially validating a religious miracle. The state's recognition gave the apparitions a layer of legitimacy that transcended the Coptic community, making it a matter of national pride and wonder. The government even began to facilitate the crowds, providing better security and lighting for the streets, effectively turning the area into a state-sanctioned site of pilgrimage. As the news of the president's sightings spread, the character of the vigil changed. It was no longer just a hidden secret for the faithful, but a collective experience for all of Egypt. Muslims and Christians stood side by side in the dusty streets, their faces turned upward toward the same flickering mystery. For Nasser, the apparitions served as a rare moment of unity for a country that had seen its share of conflict and hardship. The presence of the light offered a sense of peace that words could not provide. In the following years, until the sightings finally ceased in 1971, the memory of the president's vigil remained a powerful testament to the event's power. It reminded everyone that even those who hold the highest offices, those who deal in the hard truths of the world, are not immune to the sense of wonder that comes when the veil between the known and the unknown grows thin. The church at Zeitun became a place where the government and the divine met in the middle of a warm Cairo night, leaving behind a legacy of light that would be whispered about for decades to come. The night air in Cairo during those years of 1968 to 1971 was thick with more than just the desert heat and the low hum of a city that never truly sleeps. Above the Coptic Orthodox Church of St. Mary, the atmosphere seemed to thicken into something tangible, a heavy blanket of expectation that settled over the hundreds of thousands of souls gathered in the dusty streets below. They came from every corner of the world, carrying their hopes and their skepticism, their prayers and their cameras, all tilting their heads back until their necks ached. It was a sea of humanity, at times reaching 250,000 people in a single evening, all waiting for a glimpse of the Lady of Light. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the Egyptian sky turned to a deep, bruised purple, the Lady was not the only mystery to descend upon Zeitun. There were other signs, smaller wonders that acted as a celestial herald for her arrival, turning the space above the church into a theater of the impossible. The very air seemed to vibrate with a frequency that belonged to another realm, preparing the witnesses for the secondary phenomena that would haunt their memories for decades to come. Perhaps the most striking of these wonders were the birds. Witnesses described them as doves, yet they were like no birds known to science or nature. They were larger than any pigeon or dove found in the city, and they did not merely fly. They glowed with an internal, pearlescent radiance that made them visible against the obsidian sky. These creatures of light would appear suddenly, materializing out of the empty air in perfect formations. Sometimes they flew in groups of 2, sometimes 7, and on rare, breathtaking occasions, 12 of them would arrange themselves into the shape of a glowing cross. But it was the way they moved that truly defied logic. They did not flap their wings. Instead, they glided with an astonishing, supernatural swiftness, their wings held perfectly still as they sliced through the night. The keeper of the Cairo Zoo would later point out that pigeons and doves do not fly at night, yet here were dozens of them, circling the floodlit domes with a grace that felt ancient and intentional. When they finished their dance, they did not fly away into the distance. They simply vanished in an instant, melting away like snowflakes touching warm water, leaving the crowd in a state of stunned, collective breathlessness. As the luminous birds faded, another sensation would often sweep through the crowd, one that bypassed the eyes and moved straight to the soul. It was the scent of incense. This was not the faint, lingering aroma of a single censer used during a liturgy. This was a tidal wave of fragrance, a sweet, heavy, and hauntingly beautiful perfume that filled the streets for blocks around. Witnesses described it as a scent unlike anything on earth, a fragrance of lilies and ancient resins that seemed to manifest out of the very bricks of the church. Accompanying this smell were great, billowing clouds of smoke, often tinted with a mysterious reddish or purple hue. These clouds would pour from the sealed, stained glass windows of the domes, as if a million censers were being swung by invisible hands within the locked sanctuary. The smoke was so thick at times that it looked like a heavy fog rolling over the spectators, yet it did not sting the eyes or choke the throat. Instead, it brought a sense of profound peace. People would reach out their hands, trying to touch the swirling mist, feeling the air turn cool and heavy between their fingers, as if the veil between the physical and the spiritual had grown thin enough to tear. Above the smoke and the gliding doves, the very stars seemed to participate in the vigil. Astronomers and casual observers alike noted that the sky over Zeitun behaved erratically during the apparitions. There were reports of shooting stars that did not fall to the horizon, but hovered and danced above the church domes, flashing with a brilliance that outshone the city lights. Some described a canopy of light that would form over the building, a shower of diamonds made of pure luminescence that would pulse in rhythm with the prayers of the crowd. These were not the random movements of satellites or planes, but a synchronized display of celestial fire. On certain nights, the stars themselves appeared to shift their positions, forming a radiant crown or a glowing path for the figure of the Virgin as she walked upon the roof. This rain of diamonds would last for minutes or hours, casting a phosphorescent glow over the faces of the Muslims, Christians, and Jews who stood side by side. In those moments, the divisions of the world seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared wonder at a universe that was clearly much larger and more mysterious than they had ever dared to imagine. The power of these secondary phenomena lay in their persistence. While the figure of the lady might appear for only a few minutes, the birds, the incense, and the dancing lights often lingered, providing a sustained atmosphere of the miraculous that was impossible to ignore. Skeptics who came to debunk the sightings often found themselves silenced not by a single image, but by the overwhelming sensory evidence of the environment. How could a projector create a scent that moved against the wind? How could a hoax command a flock of light-emitting birds to fly without moving their wings? There were no speakers hidden in the minarets, no hidden machines in the domes. There was only the silence of the lady and the riot of symbols surrounding her. This was a communication beyond language, a message written in light, fragrance, and flight. For 3 years, the suburb of Zeitun became a bridge between two worlds, a place where the ordinary laws of physics were suspended to make room for a different kind of truth. Even after the apparitions ceased in 1971, the memory of those glowing doves and the scent of that heavenly incense remained etched into the hearts of a million witnesses, a reminder that sometimes the darkness is filled with more than just shadows. The story of Zeitun remains one of the most documented and widely witnessed mysteries of the 20th century, a rare moment when the supernatural stepped out into the bright lights of a modern city and stayed for all to see. The images captured on grainy film and the testimonies of a million people serve as a quiet testament to the enduring power of the unknown. As we leave the silent domes of St. Mary's and the fading scent of ancient lilies, we are reminded that the world still holds secrets that cannot be solved, only experienced. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The supernatural seemed to manifest in the physical realm with undeniable clarity. As the luminous figure became a nightly fixture above the domes of Zeitun, the initial gasps of wonder were soon joined by the cold, analytical clicking of cameras and the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of government officials. By mid-April of 1968, the phenomenon had grown far too large for the Egyptian authorities to ignore. What began as a local curiosity had transformed into a national obsession, drawing hundreds of thousands of people into the narrow, dusty streets of the Cairo suburb. For the government of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, This was not merely a matter of faith, but a matter of public order and scientific truth. The world was watching, and the skeptics were arriving with their notebooks and their light meters, determined to peel back the layers of what they assumed was a clever, calculated deception. They looked for mirrors on the surrounding rooftops and magnets hidden within the church walls, hoping to find a man behind a curtain. The first wave of investigators arrived with the precision of a military operation. These were not theologians or seekers of the divine. They were men of wire, glass, and mathematics, engineers from the state-run power company and high-ranking members of the Cairo police force converged on the Church of St. Mary, their eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of human trickery. They brought with them heavy metal ladders that scraped harshly against the ancient stone and powerful searchlights intended to expose any hidden machinery. You can almost hear the rhythmic clatter of their heavy boots on the rooftops and the sharp, echoed orders shouted across the crowded plazas. Every angle was measured, every shadow was interrogated, and every suspicious corner was illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of their torches. The air was thick with the smell of diesel from their transport trucks, and the dry, ancient dust of a city that had seen many empires rise and fall, yet none so strange as this. The prevailing theory among the skeptics was simple: a projector. In their minds, such a vivid, moving image could only be the product of a sophisticated slideshow or a clever arrangement of mirrors and focused lenses. They meticulously searched the bell towers, the minarets of nearby mosques, and the upper floors of the municipal garage, where the very first sighting had occurred. They looked for the telltale hum of a cooling motor or the silver glint of a hidden lens tucked away in a window frame. They even inspected the very masonry of the church domes, feeling the rough, sun-warmed texture of the stone for any unusual wiring or mounted brackets. The skeptics tapped on the domes with small hammers, listening for the hollow echo of a hidden compartment, but the stone remained solid and silent. Yet, as the hours turned into days, the search for a mechanical source yielded nothing but dust and the faint, lingering scent of incense. There were no wires running into the heights and no hidden rooms containing secret equipment. To be absolutely certain that the apparition was not a byproduct of some rogue electrical signal or a clever use of the city's local power grid, the authorities took a drastic and highly public step. One evening, under the direct order of the ministry, the entire district of Zeitun was plunged into a total, intentional blackout. The streetlights flickered and died, and the hum of the city's infrastructure fell into an eerie silence. A heavy, velvet darkness settled over the streets, broken only by the dim, orange glow of thousands of handheld candles. The engineers stood ready, their eyes fixed on the central dome of the church, fully expecting that without electricity, the mystery would finally vanish into the night. But as the crowd held its breath in the chilling silence of the blackout, the light began to gather once more. Far from disappearing, the figure emerged even more brightly against the pitch-black sky, a luminous, pulsing presence that seemed to generate its own internal radiance, entirely independent of the city's failing wires. It was as if the figure fed on the darkness itself. Frustrated by their lack of findings at the site itself, the investigation expanded its perimeter into the surrounding landscape. Teams of scientists and security personnel were dispatched to scan the area in a massive 15-mile radius. They traveled through the desert outskirts and the industrial zones, searching for any hidden military installation or any experimental laboratory that might be capable of beaming a long-range projection across the city. They looked for microwave towers or early laser prototypes that could explain how a three-dimensional figure could appear to move and bless a crowd from such a vast distance. They measured the atmospheric pressure and analyzed the local seismic activity, wondering if the very earth beneath Cairo was releasing some strange, luminescent gas. They interrogated the horizon, pointing their own powerful beams into the void, but no return signal ever came back from the depths of the Egyptian night. They searched through the shifting sands and the urban sprawl, but the further they looked, the more the mechanical explanations seemed to crumble into the dry desert wind. By the time the investigation concluded, the skeptics were left in a state of quiet, uneasy confusion. Every technical avenue had been explored, and every potential for a hoax had been systematically dismantled. There were no hidden projectors, no secret power sources, and no mechanical foundations to be found within the 15-mile search zone. Even President Nasser himself, a man noted for his secular and pragmatic worldview, was said to have stood among the massive crowds, witnessing the silent, glowing figure for himself. The search for a machine had ended in the discovery of a mystery that refused to be categorized by the tools of man. As the engineers packed away their equipment and the police filed their final, inconclusive reports, the people of Zeitun remained, looking upward into the night. The official documents would remain incomplete, a testament to a time when the most powerful government in the region was humbled by a light they could not switch off. The logic of the world had failed to provide an answer, leaving only the profound, shimmering silence. The investigation into the Zeitun apparitions eventually reached a peculiar crossroads. For years, the focus remained almost entirely on the sky, on the specialized cameras, and on the thousands of eyes tilted toward the white domes of the church. But as traditional explanations of fraud or mass hysteria began to fray under the weight of consistent evidence, a new group of thinkers turned their gaze downward. They wondered if the answers did not descend from the heavens, but rather rose from the very soil of Egypt itself. Deep beneath the ancient limestone and the bustling streets, the earth is never truly still. It is a slow, grinding machine of shifting plates and immense, silent pressure. In the late 1980s, a researcher named Michael Persinger proposed a theory that cast the entire event in a radical new light. Michael Persinger was a man who explored the boundaries where geophysics meets psychology. His hypothesis, known as the tectonic strain theory, suggested that the Earth acts as a massive, natural battery. Cairo sits in a region defined by its proximity to significant fault lines associated with the Red Sea Rift system. Persinger noticed a startling correlation when he examined the records. The luminous displays began in April of 1968. This was exactly 1 year before an unprecedented surge in seismic activity occurred in the Gemsa area, roughly 400 kilometers to the southeast. In the year 1969, the number of earthquakes in that specific region increased by a factor of 10. It was as if the Earth was gathering its strength, a slow-motion tension that manifested as light long before it manifested as movement. The science behind this involves a phenomenon called piezoelectricity. Imagine a crystal of quartz, a common mineral found in the granitic rocks deep within the Egyptian crust. When you apply mechanical stress to such a crystal, it generates a measurable electric charge. On a planetary scale, miles beneath the church, tectonic plates were grinding against one another, exerting millions of tons of pressure on the ancient stone. This pressure could create massive pockets of electrical energy. This energy doesn't always stay trapped. It can bleed upward through the fault lines, ionizing the air and creating what Persinger called tectonic strain-induced luminosities. These are not simple sparks, but complex, glowing balls of plasma that can hover and move with a strange, kinetic energy. To the onlookers, these lights seemed entirely otherworldly, yet they were deeply terrestrial. Persinger's theory went even deeper by addressing how the human brain reacts to such intense electromagnetic environments. He focused particularly on the temporal lobes, the parts of our brain responsible for processing sensory input and making sense of our place in the world. When exposed to specific, complex magnetic fields generated by tectonic strain, these lobes can undergo a brief moment of neurological instability. In his laboratory, Persinger used an apparatus to induce a sensed presence in his subjects. People would feel as though someone was in the room with them, or experience profound visions of light. He argued that the witnesses at Zeitun were standing in a natural laboratory, their brains being bathed in the invisible magnetic whispers of the shifting earth, creating a state where the mind becomes highly suggestible to extraordinary experiences. This is where culture and belief play their part in the narrative. A witness does not see a geological anomaly. They see what their heart and history have prepared them to see. In the deeply religious atmosphere of Cairo, a shimmering light atop a church becomes the Virgin Mary. The mind takes the raw, chaotic energy of the planet and shapes it into a familiar, comforting form. The perceived movement of the apparition, the way it seemed to bow or wave, could be the result of the flickering nature of the plasma interacting with the rapid, involuntary movements of the human eye. It is a beautiful collaboration between the geology of the rift and the architecture of the human soul, where the friction of the continents is translated into the language of faith. Critics of this theory point out that the correlation is not perfect. The distances involved are great, and not every earthquake is preceded by a lady of light. Yet, the statistical link Persinger found, a correlation of 0.56 between the seismic energy and the reports of the phenomena, is hard for the scientific community to ignore entirely. It suggests that during those 3 years, the Earth was indeed in a state of high tension. The atmosphere around the church may have been thick with more than just incense and prayer. It may have been humming with the literal electricity of the world. As the crowd stood in the cool night air, they were perhaps part of a grand, natural experiment, watching as deep pressures transformed into a message. As we listen to the soft, rhythmic hum of the world tonight, it is worth considering how much of our own experience is shaped by the ground we walk upon. We often think of ourselves as separate from the earth, as passengers on a silent and solid rock. But if the tectonic strain theory holds any truth, we are far more connected than we realize. The very movements of the continents might be capable of sparking visions in our minds and lights in our dark skies. The apparitions at Zeitun may have been a rare, luminous moment when the veil between the physical and the perceived was pulled back by the sheer force of the planet's shifting weight. The Earth is alive, moving beneath us even now, its deep rhythms dictating the stories we tell ourselves. Breathe in the cool air and let the weight of the world ground you as you drift further into the quiet of the night. The air in the Zeitun district of Cairo often held the heavy, lingering scent of dust and jasmine, a warm perfume that stayed long after the sun dipped below the horizon. On the night of April 2nd, 1968, the evening began normally for the workers at the garage on Tumanbay Street. Farouk Mohammed Atwa, a bus mechanic, was ending his shift, his mind occupied by the pain in his hand. He suffered from severe gangrene on one of his fingers, so advanced that surgeons had scheduled an amputation for the next morning. As he stepped outside into the night air, he glanced toward the Coptic church of St. Mary, and the world suddenly fractured into something impossible. High upon the central dome of the church, Farouk saw a figure. To his eyes, it was a woman in white, her form perched perilously near the edge. His heart hammered. He was certain he was witnessing a tragedy. He cried out, his voice raw, begging the woman not to jump. He feared a nun had climbed the heights to end her life. His fellow workers, Hassin Awad and Yakut Ali, rushed to his side. They too saw the luminous silhouette, but the figure did not fall. Instead, the light surrounding her intensified, radiating with a brilliance that made the street lamps seem dim. It was a shimmering, phosphorescent glow that defied the laws of shadows and light. Within hours, the quiet street was transformed. A handful of workmen swelled into a gathering of thousands. The news rippled through the city, pulling people from their homes. Among them were Coptic Christians who sang ancient hymns. Beside them stood Muslims, reciting verses from the Holy Quran, honoring the woman they recognized as Maryam, the mother of the prophet. It was a sight that many described as a bridge between worlds, a moment where the boundaries of faith seemed to dissolve in the face of the inexplicable. In a land grappling with the echoes of the Six-Day War from the previous year, this shared silence was a miracle. There were no divisions that night. There was only the collective upward gaze of a multitude looking for a sign of peace. Witnesses from every walk of life struggled to describe the experience. Bishop Athanasius, sent by the Coptic Pope, described a full figure standing 5 or 6 meters above the dome. He spoke of garments swaying in a wind no one else could feel, moving with a grace that was neither stiff nor earthly. He watched as she turned north and raised a hand in a slow, sweeping blessing over the human sea below. Others, like the physician Dr. Khairi Malik, claimed to see details that felt human. He recalled her smile, an expression where he could discern the shape of her features. An American woman, Pearl Zaki, felt she were alone with the figure, caught in a private dialogue. The skepticism of the secular world was not far behind. The Egyptian government, wary of mass hysteria, launched an investigation. They suspected projectors were being used to deceive the public. To prove this, they ordered the power cut across a 15-mile radius. As the city plunged into darkness, the crowd held its breath. But the figure on the dome did not fade. Instead, the Lady of Light appeared even more vibrant against the black sky. She was accompanied by a shower of diamonds, a cascading display of sparkling lights. Luminous white doves, appearing to be made of pure radiance, flew in perfect, silent formations above the domes, defying the natural instincts of birds to remain still at night, as if time itself had paused. These voices became the living record. Farouk Mohammed Atwa, the man who had first shouted for the lady not to jump, went to his hospital appointment the next morning. When the surgeons pulled back the bandages, they fell into a stunned silence. The gangrene was gone. His finger was whole and healthy. He was the first of thousands who would claim such healings. From officials like President Gamal Abdel Nasser to the humblest vendors, the testimony remained consistent. They spoke of a presence both vast and gentle. As the nights turned into months and years, the crowd on Tumanbay Street became a living testament to the idea that the most profound truths are found in the shared, quiet light of the stars. The air in Cairo during the spring of 1968 was heavy, saturated with more than just the rising heat of the season and the familiar sense of jasmine and wood smoke. It was a city caught in the long, cooling shadows of history, yet vibrating with a new and unsettling tension. Just 10 months prior, the nation had emerged from the Six-Day War, a conflict that had left the collective spirit of the people fractured. The loss of the Sinai Peninsula was not merely a territorial blow. It was a wound to the national identity, a profound moment of soul-searching that the people called the Naksa, or the setback. In the quiet cafes and the bustling markets, there was a sense of lingering dust, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for something to settle, for a sign that the ground beneath their feet was once again firm. It was into this landscape of uncertainty and quiet mourning that the first flickers of light began to dance atop the domes of the church in Zeitun. Imagine the scene on Tumanbay Street as the evening of April 2nd deepened into night. The street was a narrow artery of life, lined with modest shops and the sprawling garage of the Public Transport Authority. For years, the neighborhood of Zeitun had been a place of quiet coexistence, where the call to prayer from the minarets mingled with the rhythmic tolling of church bells. But on this particular night, the mundane rhythms of the city were interrupted by a sight so radiant it seemed to defy the physics of the dark. When those first workers looked up and saw a figure in white walking upon the central dome of the Church of St. Mary, they were not just seeing a woman, they were seeing a beacon. The light was described as a brilliant, shimmering silver, a luminescence that did not cast shadows but seemed to glow from within. It was a startling contrast to the dim streetlights and the flickering oil lamps of the nearby stalls. a visual promise that the darkness of the past year was not absolute. As news of the sightings spread, the demographic of the crowds that gathered began to tell a story of profound unity. In a nation often navigated by the distinct currents of faith and political ideology, the rooftop of the church became a neutral ground. Thousands, then tens of thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands of people flocked to the site. They came from every walk of life. You would see wealthy doctors standing shoulder to shoulder with street vendors, and university students in Western dress whispering prayers alongside women in traditional veils. The beauty of the moment lay in its silence. The figure atop the dome never spoke a word, yet her presence acted as a bridge across the divides of the city. For the Coptic Christians, she was the Virgin Mary, a protector, and a mother returning to a land that had sheltered her family centuries ago. For the Muslims, she was Our Lady Maryam, a figure of immense standing and holiness. In the shared gaze of the crowd, the bitterness of the recent war began to soften into a collective wonder. The political weight of these apparitions cannot be overstated. Egypt was under the leadership of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a man whose identity was forged in the fires of socialism and secular nationalism. He was a leader who had built his legacy on the strength of the state, yet even he found himself drawn to the quiet suburb of Zeitun. According to many historical accounts, Nasser himself visited the site under the cover of darkness, standing amongst the common people to witness the phenomenon. He was a man of steel and pragmatism, yet witnesses described him standing in quiet contemplation as the luminous figure appeared above the cross. His presence there was a silent acknowledgement that some things were beyond the reach of government decree or military might. By allowing the reports of the apparitions to be published in the state newspapers, and even issuing an official government statement validating the sightings, the state effectively embraced the miracle as a tool for national healing. It was a rare moment, where the secular and the divine aligned to give a grieving public permission to hope once more. The sensory experience of those nightly vigils was hypnotic. As the hours stretched toward dawn, the air around the church would cool, and a hush would fall over the massive assembly. Witnesses often spoke of the strange, glowing birds that would appear out of nowhere, luminous white doves that did not flap their wings, but glided through the air like streaks of shooting stars. The scent of incense seemed to manifest even when no censers were lit, a sweet, heavy fragrance that drifted over the heads of the pilgrims. People reported hearing the faint, melodic sound of bells or celestial music that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. The lighting was never harsh. It was a soft, pulsing glow that highlighted the elegant arches of the church, turning the limestone structure into something that appeared translucent and ethereal. In those moments, the sounds of the modern world, the distant honking of horns and the hum of the city, seemed to fall away, replaced by a sacred stillness that felt like a sanctuary from the troubles of the world. The olive branches that the figure was said to carry became the defining symbol of the era. Zeitun, whose very name means olives, was historically believed to be a stopping point for the Holy Family during their flight into Egypt. This connection to the past provided a sense of continuity and protection that the people desperately craved. The apparition was seen as a sign that God had not abandoned Egypt, that despite the humiliation of the war, the land remained holy. The unity found in those streets was a powerful antidote to the fractured morale of the 1967 defeat. It allowed for a different kind of nationalism to emerge, one rooted in spiritual resilience rather than just military strength. As the sightings continued for 3 years, they became a rhythmic part of the nation's life, a recurring reminder that even in a time of transition and turmoil, there was a light that could be shared by all, regardless of the path they walked to find it. By the time the apparitions began to fade in 1971, the fabric of Egyptian society had been subtly rewoven. The memory of the shared vigils on Tumanbay Street remained a touchstone for a generation that had seen the impossible together. The Mother of Light had served her purpose as a balm for a nation in transition, bridging the gap between a painful past and an uncertain future. As we look back at those nights in Zeitun, we see more than just a mystery of light. We see a people finding peace in the presence of the inexplicable. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. As the year 1971 began to settle over the busy streets of Cairo, a subtle but profound change took hold in the district of Zeitun. For 3 long years, the Church of St. Mary had been the epicenter of a global wonder, a place where the barrier between the earthly and the divine seemed to have worn thin. The air, once electric with the shouts of hundreds of thousands of people, began to cool into a reflective stillness. The dust kicked up by the feet of tireless pilgrims, Copts, Muslims, and curious travelers from every corner of the earth, started to settle back onto the pavement. The streetlights, which had been disconnected for long stretches by the authorities in a desperate bid to prove the lights were mere reflections, now cast a normal, amber glow. But for those who lived through the peak, the silence felt remarkably heavy. The frequency of the visions had been tapering off since the early months of 1970. What had once been a near-nightly occurrence, sometimes lasting for several hours on end, had drifted slowly into a monthly rhythm. The spectacles that had once featured a woman bright as a million suns walking along the roof were becoming more ethereal and fleeting. By the time the spring of 1971 arrived, the sightings had become precious, rare jewels of light. On the few nights when the lady did appear, she seemed more distant, her form often described as a soft, pulsing glow rather than the sharp, detailed figure seen in the early days of 1968. Yet the devotion of the faithful did not waver. They stood in the cooling breeze of the Nile, their eyes fixed upward, waiting for a final, lasting glimpse. Then came the evening of May 29, 1971. It was to be the final glorious and public sighting of what the world called Our Lady of Light. On this warm Egyptian night, the sky was clear and studded with stars that seemed to pale in comparison to the light that suddenly bloomed over the central dome. Witnesses who were present that night described a figure that appeared almost like a white statue, 10 feet tall, standing with a regal, unearthly grace. Her arms, which had so often waved in blessing to the crowds below, moved with agonizing slowness, folding over her chest in a gesture of profound prayer. A series of brilliant flashes streaked across the dark velvet of the sky, forming a luminous cross directly above her head. For several minutes, the figure remained a beacon before the light simply retracted. The cessation of the sightings did not mean the end of the miracle's influence on the people of Egypt. In many ways, the silence of the dome allowed the deeper impact of the events to truly take root in the culture. The Coptic Orthodox Church saw an unprecedented revival of faith. It was as if a promise made 50 years earlier had been kept. Back in 1918, a devout man named Ibrahim Khalil had dreamed that the Virgin Mary asked him to build a church on this very site, promising to bless it in half a century. When the lights first appeared in 1968, exactly 50 years later, the prophecy was fulfilled. The church was no longer just a local parish. It became a sanctuary for a national soul. The apparitions had served as a unifying force, a rare, shared wonder. Science has cast many theories at the mystery of Zeitun, searching for a mechanical truth behind the glow. Some researchers pointed to the tectonic strain theory, proposing that pressure within the crust could have produced luminous gases or electrical discharges known as earthquake lights. They argued that the heightened seismic activity in the years leading up to 1968 could explain the amorphous glows. Others spoke of mass hysteria, a collective psychological reaction to the trauma of the times. Yet these theories struggle to account for the consistent, detailed reports from millions of people, reports of a figure who bowed, who carried an olive branch, and who was accompanied by the heavy, unmistakable scent of incense that would spontaneously fill the air. The silence of the dome is not just a lack of light. It is the presence of an unanswered question that remains suspended. Today, the church in Zeitun remains a place of quiet, persistent pilgrimage. The icons inside are stained with the smoke of decades of candles, and the walls seem to vibrate with the echoes of the prayers once shouted into the night sky. Even in the absence of the lady in white, a sense of the sacred lingers. The mystery of the 3 years when the sky opened up over Cairo has never been fully solved. It lives on in the stories passed down through the generations. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.